Welcome to Block and Bill, a podcast from Convergence Magazine. I'm your host and the publisher of Convergence, Caden Mock. On this show, we're building a roadmap for the movement that's working to block the impacts of rising authoritarianism while building the strength and resilience of the broad front that we need to win. This week on the show, I'm joined by Marzena Zukowska and Shanelle Matthews. Together, they're the co-editors of the new book, Liberation Stories, Building Narrative Power for 21st Century Social Movements. This anthology of essays and interviews helps distill successful theories, strategies, and tactics from the movement left for anyone wanting to understand and participate in modern progressive movements. But first, these headlines. In these last 2 weeks, we've lost a few movement titans, and I wanted to take a moment to remember a couple of them. Last week, we lost a major figure in the labor movement, Kent Wong. Kent was the longtime director of the Labor Center at UCLA and a champion for immigrant youth organizing, growing the Labor Center, mentoring young organizers, and creating UCLA's Labor Studies program. And this week, we lost Stonewall veteran, organizer, and trans icon, Miss Major Griffin Gracie. Miss Major was a towering figure who also always made time to mentor and support young Black, queer, and trans people who came into her orbit. She led and built organizations, including a retreat space for trans people in Little Rock, Arkansas. Up until the end, she was a relentless champion for the liberation of all trans people and someone whose life is truly a study in joy and defiance. We remember both Kent and Miss Major for their contributions to our movements, and we recommit ourselves to the difficult work ahead in their memory. May they rise in power. You may have seen that OpenAI has released a new video model called Sora 2 and a mobile app called Sora that uses it to extrude synthetic video content. What's wild about this is how realistic a lot of the video looks. It's not as glitchy or spooky as the older versions of video synthesis algorithms, which leave some obvious tells like extra digits on hands or details that flicker in and out of existence in the frame. These videos are sometimes fooling even people who are experienced and knowledgeable about spotting synthetic dupes. Yikes. The other reason Sora 2 has been making headlines is that OpenAI continues to fumble on the supposed content guardrails that they've developed to tamp down an abuse on their platforms. The estate of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has even called the platform out for allowing users to make videos that look and sound eerily like the late civil rights leader. The problem is OpenAI's responses have pretty much amounted to playing whack-a-mole with the most visible or influential people who are complaining in public about the misuses of their late loved ones' likenesses, which doesn't really help the rest of us. This is all happening at a time when even the people building AI companies increasingly agree that this is a massive economic bubble. It goes without saying that Sora 2 isn't making OpenAI any money, nor do they have a credible plan for how it might. In the meantime, this shitty product is being unleashed on the world and will inevitably deepen the fissure between consensus reality and conspiratorial fever dreams that's driving so much of our politics these days. On a lighter note, can I just say that I appreciate all the inflatable creatures who've been showing up at the Portland ICE detention center to protest? Not only does it make for some really funny videos that even mainstream media can't resist, like this video that you might have seen of them doing the hokey pokey in front of a line of cops, but humor can also be a useful way of delegitimizing a regime. As Hannah Arendt wrote in On Violence, the greatest enemy of authority is contempt, and the surest way to undermine it is laughter. In their campaign to overthrow the Serbian dictator Slobodan Milosevic, the protest group Otpor deployed street theater like placing a barrel with Milosevic's face on it and asking passersby to beat the barrel with a stick. This harmless protest was escalated by the goofiness of authorities having to come and essentially arrest the barrel and take it away. Similarly, the press interview with the frog who got pepper sprayed in its inflation valve is a masterclass in absurdity. When asked about how it felt, all the protester had to say was that,
I just kind of coughed a little, noticed a small hint of peppermint, and just continued to be in my frog costume after that.
Keep it weird, Portland. Finally, the Trump administration is escalating the bizarre and honestly horrific attacks that they claim are intended to stop Venezuelan drug smuggling, as Trump openly stated this week that he's authorized CIA action in the country. As for his reasoning, he made a bunch of unfounded claims about Venezuela, quote, emptying their prisons into America and smuggling drugs, claims that have been easily disproved by some very basic press investigations. A semi-bipartisan effort is being made right now in the Senate to force a vote to bar him from continuing these and further actions, but anything moved by the Senate is very likely to be vetoed by Trump, who's going to do whatever the hell he wants anyway. It's difficult to parse the degree to which Trump truly believes the feedback loop of conservative media claims that Venezuela is this primary source of drug smuggling into the U.S., or if this is a rerun of the neocon regime change for oil model we've seen directed at the country throughout this century, Or even worse, if this is just truly the level of amped up fascist thuggery this administration has reached, and they're doing it purely for sport. It wouldn't surprise me if it's kind of a toxic soup of all three of those things, honestly. And any way you slice it, a couple dozen people have been killed already in extrajudicial attacks, and there appears to be basically no oversight as he's fast-tracked this intervention. As any action by Congress seems unlikely to stop us from engaging in terrorism or outright war in Venezuela, our movements need to build even deeper international solidarity against the violence of U.S. empire.
Hey everybody, this is Maurice Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party. I read and give to Convergence because it has become a home for me to engage in critical analysis, find practical advice for organizing and strategy, and inspiration in the belief that a better world is not only possible, we can build it.
To make either a one-time donation or become a sustaining member, visit convergencemag.com/donate. You can find a direct link in the show notes. Thanks for listening.
Both on this show and in our broader work at Convergence, we've been thinking deeply about the necessary and difficult work around narrative that's needed to win in our current political environment. A few weeks ago on this program, we explored the challenges for movements gaining control of the infrastructure upon which narratives are built and delivered. In this episode, we'll be focusing more specifically on narrative power, that is, how we build successful political narratives. We'll both define and explore this further in today's interview with the co-editors of the new anthology, Liberation Stories, Building Narrative Power for 21st Century Social Movements. My guests this week include Marzena Zukowska. As an undocumented Polish immigrant who grew up in Chicago, they co-founded and co-directed POMOK, a UK-based immigrant rights organization that builds progressive power among Eastern Europeans. They spent a decade developing narrative and organizing strategies for leading social and political movements in the United States, the UK, and Europe. And my other guest is their co-editor, Shanelle Matthews. She's a movement communication strategist and founder of the Radical Communicators Network. She leads narrative strategy for coalitions, including the Movement for Black Lives and Rising Majority. Shanelle also teaches narrative power and political communication at the City College of New York and across movement spaces globally. We recorded this interview earlier in the week. Please enjoy. All right, Shanelle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Marzena, it's good to see you as well. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks so much, Caden.
Well, can you tell our listeners a little bit about Liberation Stories, what it is, who it's for, and kind of how you started down the journey of putting together an anthology like this? Shanelle, why don't we start with you?
Sure. But generally, this book is an exploration of the relationship between narrative and power, primarily within the U.S. empire. And it's really about how everyday working class people and social movements maintain democracy against ever-rising opposition. Specifically, what we're examining in Liberation Stories, Building Narrative Power for 21st Century Social Movements, is how left social movements have established narrative power for bold and big ideas in the first quarter of the 21st century. So we saw movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too, Not One More, Medicaid for All, of course, the mutual aid work over COVID, LGBTQ rights, all expand in this very progressive era. And so as movement communications workers, we're always talking about how every single aspect of our society has a narrative dimension. Let's take the contemporary example of Trump's so-called big, beautiful bill. One side, one faction is telling a story about how this is going to be good for working class Americans, and another side is telling a story about how this is going to be cutting Medicaid for 16 million people. Mm-hmm. And so what we're doing is really fighting and contesting for ideological power. And this book is an exploration of that. And so in this way, we are fighting for what's not just true, but also what people will believe. And we'll talk a little bit about what narrative power means later. But part of the reason why we organized this anthology over the last 6 years was because we believe that this discipline of narrative power deserves to be studied and examined. We deserve, as communications workers in the left, to understand how our communications tactics served the working class people that we aim to serve, and where we could grow and do better. And also, this was really a love letter to movement workers who do this kind of work. This was the first book project for me because it was the book that I needed. So often our work is really behind the scenes as communications workers. And, that's intentional. It's not about ego, but rather about impact. And so for me, books like Reimagining Change by Patrick Rinesborough and Doyle Canning were like Bible to me when I first started. But what we really wanted was a case study book that looked at contemporary examples and gave us an idea of how our work was doing. And so, we learned a lot. And like all disciplines, when you reflect, you learn where you can do better. But this text really gives, I teach full time at City College, and importantly, this text gives, new movement workers, students, young people an opportunity to decide if they want to invest in the discipline of narrative power and be a part of movements in that way. And it also just introduces them to new insights about how movements operate and the kind of work that we do.
Yeah, and maybe I can add to around the structure of the anthology and why we intentionally wanted to convey the work of narrative power builders in this kind of a form. First off, we want this anthology to exist in the legacy of other radical anthologies. I think on the book tour we talked about like the revolution will not be funded by Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, this bridge called My Back by Shay Moraga and Gloria Ansaldúa. So we wanted this to very much be in the lineage of creating multiplicity of voices. I think, we talk about narrative power, we talk about dominant narratives, and one thing we often reflect on is how the story of social movements, kind of how it exists in popular imagination and often is presented even by our opposition, is very much veers into the story of the hero narrative, right? Or respectability politics. So, you've either got the leader or the founder at the helm of the organization, or there's this assumption and whitewashing of movements that they succeed because they end up conforming to these kind of idealized strategies, right, that are deemed more acceptable or more palatable. So for us, it was really crucial to create space specifically for radical left analysis and to show that social movements succeed because they're made up of everyday people who are kind of taking up the mantle and saying, we're not going to have ICE agents in our neighborhoods, right? We're not going to be banning books at school board meetings, and really show that social movements succeed because they deploy a diversity of tactics, right? And that includes a radical left flank strategy and why these strategies should not be thrown under the bus, but need to be included in this kind of ecosystem. So, I think the last thing I'll mention is that the book is, we didn't think it was going to become as comprehensive as it did, but it ended up covering, it was really hard for us to stop saying yes, because there's so many important campaigns of the last 25 years and so many movements that we could have included, but it covers 24 years of movement history. And we intentionally started at the turn of the century. So in 2000, kind of going from the Clinton era into what happened under Bush, and specifically starting with the War on Terror chapter, because as we know, that infrastructure that was built has impacted the social movement left at every single turn. And so in a way to bookend it, the last chapter that we finished by Tanya Kaylani and Nora Ericott actually ended up being an interview. They had written about a very different moment in the legacy of Palestine liberation solidarity, but ended up pulling out that chapter because after October 7th, in good faith, after the genocide started, the analysis that they put forward needed to change. And so it's a really powerful interview. So that kind of lineage from the War on Terror to where we are today with Palestine was quite crucial to lift up. And yeah, so much more good stuff that I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah, I mean, that makes so much sense to me as like a sort of critical period to retrospect on. I feel like there's like it's wild to me to say this a little bit, is that I do feel like over the past 8 or so years, we've kind of like forgotten in like sort of popular media what the early 2000s was like, which is wild to me. But it was not that long ago. And it makes sense to me that there are some like clear sort of origin stories about when people started thinking about narrative in this particular way. Before we get into like some specific stories, I also want to pull out the Radcom's narrative power framework. First of all, like, can we define narrative power together for the purposes of this conversation, and talk a little bit about this 6-part framework from Radcom's? It might be familiar to some of our listeners, but I'm sure it's going to be new to a lot of folks. So Shanelle, do you want to start?
Yeah, happy to jump in here. So, in our organizations and our movements, we talk a lot about different types of power: economic power, social power, political power. We rarely talk about narrative power explicitly. And I think that's partly because of the kind of function that it plays, not just in our movements, but in our everyday lives as these kind of invisible elements that shape everything from our material conditions to the way that our worldviews are established. And so narrative power is a type of power that determines what we believe, what we're willing to act on. It shapes the norms and rules in our society. It's really about the ability to shape society through worldviews, beliefs. And so we understand the importance of frameworks inside of social movements as essential for helping to situate narratives and stories in the context of broader conditions and history and power. And so we've been working as comms workers using frameworks from disability justice frameworks. There are queer frameworks. There are, frameworks that exist in the environmental justice movement. And we wanted to also build on existing frameworks that we had been introduced to inside of communications, like, for example, the Battle of the Story from the Center for Story-Based Strategy. So when we think about a narrative power framework, it's really a way of seeing and acting that uses these symbolic resources and messages and narratives to resist oppression and to build power for a liberatory society. And the 6 interconnected elements are a narrative power analysis, narrative principles, narrative traditions, narrative opportunities, narrative possibilities, and narrative interventions. And we won't go through all of them, but what I will say is that what we learned in putting together this framework is that there was amazing tools that we had already been introduced to, like the narrative power analysis, which I learned from the Center for Story-Based Strategy, which is really just about analyzing how narrative functions and how we can design like more effective narrative strategies that don't just respond to moments or react to them, but also shift those stories. That was really helpful. And also it was insufficient to stop at the analysis part. We really wanted to think also about the different kind of principles that guide our work. I remember being inside of different nonprofit institutions and realizing that being a nonprofit worker and being a movement worker were radically different. And I found that that was true because movements are guided by a set of principles, but also guided by a set of traditions. So I think about the Black radical tradition, the feminist traditions, labor organizing traditions. And so principles and traditions kind of work together. We wanted values-based guardrails for how we do our narrative power building. And we also wanted to anchor our work in longer traditions and history of our social movements. When it comes to the last 3 interventions, possibilities and opportunities, possibilities are really about the range of options in the political system where we can make change. Possibilities under the Trump administration look really different than the possibilities under a Biden administration, or in a reactionary era versus a progressive era. And so what becomes possible really is determined by the conditions. And we can make things possible. That's also a question of strategy, narrative strategy. But the narrative opportunities are the possibilities that we're ready to act on. And that is predicated on our movement conditions and how prepared we are to make those finally interventions, which are, the political tools that we use to change the course of history or society or the way people think about particular ideas. So these are quite a few elements. It's broken down in the book. We also did a interview with Nonprofit Quarterly where they did a beautiful write-up about it. All that to say, this is one offering in the kind of revolutionary toolbox of communication strategies. We think it's an effective one to give people a tool for how to do their narrative power building, which can be a little bit obscure and unclear sometimes.
No, and I think that the thing that I really love about it is this marriage of values and traditions that I think that, like, my experience as somebody who came up in like digital first organizing was that so much of our work felt unmoored from the traditions that like I was previously steeped in the labor movement, and like finding ways to connect those things actually feels like an important point of continuity between what's happening now and what has happened in the past. And it feels to me also like people are hungry for that tradition piece and figuring out how our values and traditions might work together to like build something new.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing, I teach a class at City College called Narrative Power and the Black Radical Tradition, and it goes into 200 years of communication strategies and Black social movements. And even before, thinking about the abolitionist movement, I teach about Ida B. Wells and her campaign to end lynching. We go into the Maroon movements and their communication strategies. And it really does help to contextualize for people that we weren't the first and we won't be the last. And there are things that we can learn, not to romanticize the past. I do think that the left spends too much time romanticizing past movements, but I think there are things that we can learn from those movements, and that history anchors us in those traditions. And it also builds resilience in our movements to just remember that we are part of these long histories and movement traditions that guide us.
Yeah, and I think about the most successful movements of the last, of the 21st century, and how so many of them have been able to connect the present moment to a certain historical past and those traditions, and be really disciplined about those values and actions, those guardrails, those principles that we're talking about. One example that's coming to mind, actually, that I had written about with my colleague Chantel Lunt in the book, which, our chapter was specifically about fascism in Europe and the resurgence of fascism, which obviously is happening globally. But there was something about writing about Europe, the kind of hotbed and the home of fascist ideology of the 20th century. There's a particular experience, and Chantel held down more of the UK side of things. She founded an organization called Merseyside Black Lives Matter. Is an incredible northern Liverpool organizer, and then my chunk was specifically about the Polish abortion rights movement, which was in many ways a movement that came up in 2015. It was a movement that brought me back into many of my Eastern European roots. I had grown up in Chicago in a very conservative Polish community, and as a trans and queer person, when I came to a certain age, I started to disconnect from a lot of those roots. And what I wasn't taught, and I had to go to Polish Saturday school every single week for like 10 years, but they didn't teach us the radical leftist histories of Poland. And so when I witnessed this group of Polish feminists hosting these incredible mass mobilizations in the streets of Warsaw and Poznań and Lublin, dressed in all black, wielding these black umbrellas, I was like, wow, this is a side of Poland that I hadn't felt connected to before. And the more I started to dig in and kind of understand not just the principles, but the symbolism and the aesthetics that they used. Fresco Stees, who also wrote a chapter on cultural engineering and liberation stories, often talks about solidification and specifically studies the design and aesthetics of resistance. And the Polish Women's Strike, which was one of the main anchor organizations of that era, the black umbrellas, the black clothing was a specific symbolic choice, right, of defiance and of mourning. And it signified values, right? It signified values in opposition to a far right regime that was also playing their own game of co-opting certain symbols from Poland's past. For example, the Solidarity movement, right? The shipyard workers who, in the 1980s joined together with the student movements to uproot the authoritarian communist regime. And what I found out in doing some research is that the Polish Women's Strike was actually hearkening back to 19th century Polish women's anti-Russian protests, and also picking some elements from the 1975 Icelandic Women's Strike. And then in the present day, oftentimes I would see people at protests with the green bandanas from the Argentine anti-misogyny, anti-violence, and pro-abortion rights movements. And it was that piece around transnational solidarity and really taking abortion rights not just as an issue that was impacting reproductive rights for people in Poland, but putting it in conversation with much bigger internationalist movements. And I think that made a massive difference. Ultimately, we voted the Law and Justice Party out of power, but we have yet to see the liberalization of abortion in Poland. So, these are the fights that persist.
Yeah, the struggle continues as always. That sort of vision into how then those historical awarenesses then can inform interventions that will make sense to the people who are supposed to be seeing them is, I think, really important. That often I think when we talk about communication, sometimes people are not necessarily talking in depth about who is the intended audience, who is supposed to receive this, and what is the work that intervention does. But I think looking at that sort of genealogy of symbolism it's a gift to really unpack something like that and spend the time thinking about it. I imagine as editors, you all also have specific pieces that sort of stand out to you and that you've been thinking about a lot. And so what are some of the chapters in the book that have really sort of stood out to you, especially, a lot of the work that you did on the book happened pre 2024 election. You went on book tour in like this year. What are some of the things that like people have really come back to and want to talk about in the present, reflecting on the lessons from the book?
I can jump in and just say I think the forward is really powerful. So the forward is written by Malkia Devich-Cyril and Jen
Friend of the pod.
Soriano.
Yeah.
Both storied movement workers and brilliant thinkers. And that's part of the reason why we asked them to write the forward, also because they have a kind of meta observation perspective on the social movement left and on the function of narrative power. And, what they do in there is they define the role of the radical communicator. So this book was organized through an organization that Mars and I both helped to administer. I founded in 2016 called the Radical Communicators Network. And RadComs really serves as a repository for left and progressive communications workers who are looking to sharpen their strategies on how to build narrative power and do strategic communications work across different organizations. But it's also a place where we can think about the function of our discipline. And as I was mentioning earlier, narrative power really is about the ability to tell stories in a society, including who gets to tell them and how those stories are interpreted. And that job is not a new job. The role of communications in narrative and social movements has been around for a long time. We've always used stories to fight back against fascism, to offer emotionally charged and relevant ways for people to understand and make meaning of the world around them. I mean, we believe, I think I can speak for both of us, that storytelling is really the foundation of democracy, that in order for people to take collective action, they first have to share a common understanding of what it is that they're fighting for. And that's a lot of what we are trying to do. And so Mac and Jen really lay out for us the role of rising fascism, the role of authoritarianism, why it's so important that we offer people a compelling and materially grounded story about how we make society beneficial for all people. Because if we don't do that, other people will, and they're going to sell them fear instead of freedom. And we have, these incredible institutions, narrative power institutions, Reframe, the Center for Story-Based Strategy, Berkeley Media Studies Group, other research institutes like Frameworks and Harmony Labs, as well as Race Forward, who are all doing narrative work in the progressive sector. And this forward is beautifully written to lay out not only why that work is so important, but also what the role of the individual radical communicator is in our movements. And so I just really appreciated their analysis and their forecasting, and also their level setting and grounding in historical context, and giving us an actual mandate. So towards the end of their chapter, it lists kind of 10 things that make up a radical communicator. And we printed that out and gave them out during the book tour because, as Mars mentioned earlier, Fresco talks about solidification. Solidification really is about the internal faction of a group getting closer through our actions, through our aesthetics, our chants, our songs. And although I think that there can be some challenges with the bifurcation of communications and other disciplines within social movements, I see this happening with organizing in comms, even though I think every organizer is a communicator, I often go back to Mike Miller's piece, what is an organizer? Mike Miller was an organizer for SNCC, and he wrote a great piece, What is an Organizer? And at the end of it, at the end of describing what an organizer is, he says an organizer has conversations, and that really is, the crux of communication. So I would say the forward is something people should read. I assign it in my class that we teach on the book so that people can really get a grasp of what this discipline does inside of social movements and how it intersects and differs from other disciplines. Mars, what about you?
Yeah, I'll go back maybe briefly to, I think, the War on Terror chapter, again, written by Dr. Maha Halal and Curry Peterson Smith, I think is a really important one because it opens the book. I think after the forward and after the intro, it's the next one that people should read. And then afterwards, feel free to choose your own adventure. But I think, the War on Terror very much normalized mass surveillance, indefinite detention, racialized policing, not just in the US, but across the globe. And this was able to be justified because of the stories that were told about certain communities, Black and Brown communities, Muslim communities. And I think the importance of being able to trace that lineage so that we can keep addressing it, because it has a way of continuing to seep in. I mean, the criminalization of dissent that we're seeing in the US, but also globally. I can't help but think about this chapter when I see the criminalization of Palestine action in the UK. I mean, this is happening under a purportedly left government. I mean, it's center right, ultimately the Labour Party, but this is this has been allowed because of the normalization and demonization of movements that has happened over the last 2.5 decades. So I think that chapter is definitely one to keep coming back to. I think there is a really, really nice and short case study by Ermelinda Cortez and Jess St. Louis that I also often come back to, which looks at the 2016 North Carolina's anti-trans bathroom bill fights and kind of the cultural strategy that ended up countering it. And one of the biggest takeaways from that chapter is how do you build coalitions that are able to center the right principles and values so that we don't end up falling into the trap of pursuing slogans that don't actually make lives for trans people any safer, but allow certain coalitions to kind of wash their hands clean of we tick this box, we talked about this community. And I think with that in particular, I mean, ultimately it was also a fight around economic justice. Many of these state level bills, in addition to making it harder for trans people to use the bathroom, were about making sure that minimum wage legislation did not get expanded. So I think that's a really nice case study that connects those two movements. Yeah, those are a few of my favorites.
Kaden, can I add just one
more? Oh, yeah, of
course. Yeah, if you don't mind. I just was thinking about the chapters in the book that took me by surprise. And I'm thinking about one on the retail apocalypse by Asha Demathieu and Alia Sarbawal. And when I taught this in my class, I would say it's one of the issues that there is like a small group of folks on the left that work on, and most of us are just not exposed to it. So this story really is about the private equity firms who bought out a lot of these institutions like Toys R Us and Kmart in the early 2000s, because in the narrative that they espoused or asserted was that people were moving towards online shopping, when in fact, online consumerism only made up 10% of consumerism at that point. And so we were, they're explaining like, what is the real story here? And really it's about private equity being greedy, buying these companies for parts and putting people out of jobs. And this story was characterized by like the unemployed workers being organized, telling their stories, talking about, the challenges to get people to understand that these are real meaningful jobs for people that people have had for 20 and 30 years, that these are their families, that if you work at Toys R Us and you've been there for 20 years, that you go to, birthday parties of your colleagues' kids, that you see them go through hard challenges, that this isn't just a job for a teenager, which is often the narrative. And so it really helped me first understand what private equity was. I'm not going to lie. I really just was, not clear about that, but also to understand like all this work that's happening behind the scenes by organizers who are thinking about how the economy is functioning and how laid off or unemployed workers can be mobilized to organize for resources that they very well deserve, but also for dignity in work. And I thought that was really powerful. And then I'll just say one other thing. The book also has a segment, a section on tactics. And so Dr. Kathy Cohen, along with some of her colleagues at the University of Chicago, did this amazing piece on whether or not data could be liberatory. And so they run an organization called Gen Forward, where they do polling and dial testing on youth opinions, specifically around Black youth opinions. So so I thought that was really powerful. And I also really liked, Mars mentioned the chapter that Fresco did, but there's also a global section where we have chapters from colleagues in Brazil. They're looking at the kind of, as Black gay men start to assert themselves in Brazilian society, what the reaction is to that, particularly through popular culture and social media. And then we also have a really beautiful chapter from two of our colleagues in Nigeria who write about the End SARS protest that was happening at the same time as the Defund the Police protest in 2020. And we really appreciated being able to look at how narrative power building happens under different regimes, under different conditions, and what the outcome of that is. How can Nigerian organizers assert their desires and their demands in a way that can be heard? And how is that different than how organizers in the US and other places are doing that as well?
Yeah, that feels like also a really unique contribution of the book, that like we don't get a lot of insight into the sort of like communication strategy and the like narratives that are being built by movements in other countries, whether that's like a language barrier thing or whatever. That like I felt like those were some of the things that surprised me the most. That I was like, oh wow, like this thing is happening. People are thinking about this in different ways and in different contexts, but you can see how they all relate, which is really cool.
Yeah, so many folks have been like, "Oh, are you gonna do, a Liberation Stories Part Two?" And what we want to tell people is that we are so ready to hold your hand through this process, but the reality is that it would be that we'd love to see more anthologies like this come out regularly. Like, it doesn't have to be a fully published book. It could be like a quarterly journal, but also, led by editors and narrative practitioners from other countries, from other regions of the world, because the process might look different. And
Yeah.
yeah, so and also I think every single person who is featured in the book deserves to have their own single authored book. Every single one of those chapters could be expanded upon to create an entire thesis, because the level of detail, like the level of movement knowledge that is even encapsulated in each of those chapters, they're between what, like 3,000 and 4,000 words. It's packed with a lot of tools for practitioners who want to get their hands dirty.
A lot of tools and a lot of rigor, right? Like, people are really reflecting deeply on what they have been building, which I think is also like such an important contribution. It's not just people sort of like basically putting out like an advertisement for the quality of their own work, but actually like deeply interrogating their assumptions, the things that they learned, how things need to evolve, which I think is an important like editorial intervention, So
Yeah, one of the values we have at Radcoms is about dialectical thinking. We really, practice this philosophy that Grace Lee Boggs introduced to me for the first time, around just being aware of like how the conditions around us are changing. And we mentioned earlier, part of the reason that we organize this anthology is because we're movement workers. We want to contribute to the revolutionary corpus of movement text in our specific discipline. We think that's important, but also because the conditions are constantly changing. I mean, this book was written during, the progressive, a more progressive era. We are now in a reactionary era. What happens between 2024 and 2060 and 2070 will also need to be organized, into some kind of a text or some kind of reflection. And also, like, what makes us better at our work? What helps us to, like, serve working class people better? What makes us more humble around doing this communications work? And how are we aware of how our own vision of the way we should do our work has maybe turned into a trap, as Boggs says? And, we think we have a responsibility in many ways to do this analysis rigorously, as left practitioners.
Yeah, Mars, do you have something you'd like to add? I know you're also excited about this.
Well, I just wanted to share an interesting anecdote, which is that, as you know, Chanel and I made the decision to co-edit this anthology. And in that ethos, we also asked all of the contributors to co-author chapters. But, we did that as an intentional choice, as an intentional editorial choice, because co-authorship really challenges us as communications workers to be accountable, not just to our work, but to each other. And this kind of collaborative work requires a level of principled struggle. Chanel and I we worked on this for 6 years. We were on the phone with each other pretty much every Friday of that time, at least an hour every Friday, with the intention of also learning, not just from the authors, but from each other. I mean, I feel like both of us came out smarter on the end of this, on this project. And also, I think it required a level of humility and negotiation, recognizing that one person does not have all of the answers. That, you asked about the definition, how we can anchor ourselves in a definition of narrative power, but every single one of the authors probably has a slightly different definition of narrative power that is adapted from the grassroots and from the people and the base building that they do themselves, from their community members. So, with a project like this, it's like, how do you speak from the collective but then also leave space for the individual, for the I? So
one of the things that also struck me, and I think we talked about the sort of like periodization of this book also being like about the beginning of the war on terror, but it also strikes me that like another sort of like concurrent thing that emerged starting in the early 2000s was sort of like real productization of the internet and turning the internet into like a household thing, and the way in which the emergence of like the internet as something that's just like a part of the fabric of our everyday life has also changed the narrative conditions that we're working in. And I'm curious if like you think that like, if you saw that sort of like people grappling with that as part of their writing, part of their thinking, and that like if thinking about those sort of like material conditions of the way that we do our communications work, really, like if there's like an evolution that you see through the book looking at the past 24, 25 years.
Yeah, I think it's implicit and explicit. Your question and how it shows up in the book. I mean, we have an explicit chapter on mis and disinformation by Jacqueline Mason and Jaime Longoria, which goes into the, what racialized disinformation is, how it's functioned, and gives some examples of how it showed up in the 2010s, which I think is very important because it certainly impacts the way we do our work and forces us sometimes to be in a reactionary position to have to contend with that disinformation, which can spread quickly and effectively. And I think the other things that you're talking about really is how we do movement building, in this fourth industrial revolution characterized by all these different kind of technologies. One thing is that the book talks about and around narrative infrastructure, of which, the internet is infrastructure. And I think we can all agree that, the right has really succeeded with their media machines, their meme farms, their bot farms, and that the left really lacks that kind of durable resource ecosystem of narrative infrastructure. We don't own the means of communication, and sometimes we do a good job of exploiting them, but not often. So I think that just to be solutions oriented around this, like we need our own narrative infrastructure. We can't rely on infrastructure built by our political adversaries or people who are at the very least confused about what side they want to be on. We need tech co-ops. You know this. I mean, you belong to the Movement Media Alliance. We need decentralized networks. We need media tools that don't reward outrage or dehumanization. So, yeah, I think that the role of the internet plays an interesting one in our communications work. I think we could do a better job of taking advantage of opportunities to reach people. And also, this is just to say, I think the left is deeply reflective right now about our ethos over the last, 25 years, 10 years, 15 years. Have we used the internet to reach people, or have we just created echo chambers where we're kind of talking to people who already agree with us or reinforcing ideas that are already out there, as opposed to creating interventions, using the internet to create interventions. So I can just, just one example I'll give you, like, my chapter with Miski Noor, who is the publisher at The Forge, who used to be the co-director at Black Visions and also worked with me on the comms team at the Black Lives Matter Global Network from 2016 to 2018. In our chapter, we write about the Black radical tradition in the 21st century, which is in many ways characterized by access to the internet, right? You can look at Oscar Grant, right, being killed in Oakland in 2010, and that being put online, the death of Sandra Bland, which was recorded, the death of Michael Brown, which was recorded, and of course, the death of George Floyd. This information, the internet gave Black communities an opportunity to share information with their own narrative, as opposed to it being shared from a top-down centralized network like the police or the news. And that is what the 21st century is characterized by. It's not top-down information. We now have influencers and pundits who are able to create their own ideas, put their own ideas out there and shape public opinion. And that is so important when we think about how change happens. Think about 2020, right? We had 26 million people in the street in America. Global reaction to George Floyd's death. That changed how people understood, I think, racial justice. We've seen a lot of regression on that because that's how politics works. It's quite cyclical. But the internet has forever changed the way that people understand and perceive, I think, of social movements. But I also would caution us, because when Sandra Bland died, that officer said, basically, it doesn't matter what is shown on my camera. They're going to believe me because I have the legitimacy. So the limitations of the internet are there too, right? Like, it's not really about what you see on the body camera, which why body cameras were not effective as a solution in the 2010s. It's really about how people understand Black bodies and anti-Blackness, and whether or not they see us as victims of police violence, among other types of state violence, or as legitimate survivors or victims. And so, yes, lots we can do. We need to create new infrastructure. We also need to be mindful of the limitations of the internet.
Yeah, it also strikes me that the other part of the backlash that we're seeing now is the sort of like consolidation of traditional media, right? Whether it's like this whole CBS News situation where Larry Ellison and his son bought the network and they're bringing in Barry Weiss to be the like editorial lead for CBS News, that like the way that the infrastructure is run is also part of the struggle, it seems like, around how our movements can win on narrative and build real narrative powers. Like, we need to be thinking about the material conditions that these things take place in. You know, I'm obsessed with this. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And a couple of things I'm thinking about is, I think any work, I mean, if we believe that narrative power focuses on organizing, right, it's also a form of organizing, and we need to, meet people where they're at, right? Because that's what organizing is about. It's us going out into the communities. It's us working from a level that is grassroots and not kind of making assumption that everyone who comes to us, is already an intersectional feminist, because then we would be, talking with a very, very limited group of people.
Right.
But if we're about meeting our communities where they're at, then work online has to be seen as part of this kind of harm reduction strategy, right? We cannot afford to not be in those spaces building online communities, because that's where communities are.
Right.
For a lot of people, the online community space is more powerful, comes with more emotion than what exists in the day-to-day material reality, right? So there's a tug and pull. Shanelle talked about dialectics, right? And that actually, when we're able to look at two opposing truths, the more powerful truth, the new world, is able to come out, from the middle. And I think about this a lot, because I'm the co-director of Pomots, and we are trying to, here in the UK, build progressive power among Eastern Europeans. There are around 2.2 million Eastern Europeans, and part of the project is to build a sense of collective identity, right, amongst the group of people who have had historically this identity thrust upon them. Because East was everything, east of a certain point that was defined by Western Europe. So what does it mean to then be able to reclaim this kind of identity? And one of the most effective strategies for getting people through the door of our like political education workshops and like organizing meetings here locally has been to create really amazing like left Eastern European meme content. And there are people of certain generations in our movement who are like, I don't get it, like I don't get these memes. And we're like, because it's not for you.
It's not for you, yeah.
It's not, you're not on our TikTok or our Instagram, or maybe you visit from time to time. But you're not the target audience. But it's tapping into that space of, this is a part of a collective identity that I also want to build, and it's a way to get people through the door. And I think a lot of tactical narrative power building starts there. It starts with a conversation. It's like Shanelle said, every organizer is a communicator. Marshall Gans talks about public narrative, because that is ultimately what organizers are building. So I think, that's, I feel like I went off there, but I
no, I love that though, because it's like a real vision of narrative also as the work to rebuild an idea of a constituency that like has been so fragmented by basically neoliberalism, and like turning so much of our civic experience into the experience of consumers, right? That like that's the cultural work that neoliberalism does, and there's like a cultural task for movement communicators that's like, how do we reconceptualize ourselves as community, as constituency, as like blocks of people who can like move and take action and be protagonists in the story of the future, really.
Yeah, I think that is broadly the challenge of the social movement left communications worker right now. Especially. I mean, we are fighting right now to earn the trust of working class people in the face of a lot of propaganda against the left. And, it's a bit of a puzzle, and it requires, that infrastructure that we've been talking about. It requires resources from philanthropy. It requires networks It requires our ability for us to not wait for the press to come to us, like that, to what you were talking about earlier with the consolidation of press. I mean, we have to create authentic opportunities online for people to engage with big, bold ideas of progress. And I think, I've been 15 years a movement worker. We've done some really incredible work. We've also really closed the circle of belonging with our highfalutin language. And, I love talking about Marx just as anybody else, but I don't think it's an appropriate conversation for the Doors. And so we
that's real.
ask ourselves, like, how do we make materially grounded arguments that are about the big ideas that we all care about in ways that everyday people can hear and in ways that don't isolate us from working class people, especially since a lot of progressive movements, in the past have been made up of those same people. So yeah, I think it is the challenge right now in this reactionary era for left communications workers, organizers, policy advocates, and those of us who generally care about resisting fascism and building a more, democratically socialist society. Like, how do we do that for our various and, differently interested constituents across the US?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, on that, I wonder, I'm, obviously writing a book in some ways is like going to be a like retrospective project, but I'm sure it's also brought you in contact with more people who are then also thinking about like, how do we project this forward? Thinking about that task, are there interventions? Are there things that you're seeing emerging in the field that give you hope about what this sort of like next period of narrative struggle is looking like?
I would say from my end, kind of building on what Shanelle mentioned, I think, our job in many ways is to build solidarity. And I think it's to build solidarity on a level that is able to go beyond nation state borders. I will quote Marx and Engels.
This is the place to do it. This is the place to do it.
Who said that nationalist ideology is a propaganda tool of society's dominant economic class, right? So our work needs to be inherently internationalist as one of the core principles. And I think there's so many powerful examples. I mean, I think the Palestine Liberation Movement has for decades, for 8 decades, built narrative, material, and economic infrastructure for this moment right now. Mm-hmm. I think what Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives, has been able to build. I mean, the fact that you have Black Lives Matter chapters in Poland and across Eastern Europe is incredibly powerful, right? That sense of building collective identity in the face of oppression. And I think like workers' rights movements as well. I often think about how, the body and withholding labor is one of the most fundamental and crucial strategies available to our movements, I think alongside boycotts, of course. And there is no revolution without the labor movement, right? And that's the case globally. So I think in that in mind, I'm thinking about internationalism. Internationalism as a concept has been so core to so many workers' rights movements, but I think one of my biggest critiques, I think especially what I have seen in Europe and the US, of how kind of socialist workers' movements have become very navel gazing, right? They haven't been spaces where someone who doesn't know anything about Marxist ideology is able to feel welcome and accepted without kind of parroting the same talking points, right? I think we really need to meet people where they're at. And that's international solidarity.
I will match your Engels and Marx with a quote from the Ida B. Wells, who says to this point about how we do it well, you never need to use a word with 2 syllables where one will do. And I think this is her writing in the 1930s in her magazine to Black people about lynching, about Black rights, about abolition. And she's like, look, like the reality is like these folks have a lot going on. I don't need to beat them over the head with these ideas. And I think we could learn a lot from that. To add on to what Mars was saying, just about the future and what's going well. I mean, the mutual aid that we've seen from COVID to climate disaster has been incredibly inspiring, and it really illustrates the broad breadth of progressive and perhaps left, in some instances, ideology that people believe helping other people is the right thing to do, especially when your government is unwilling to take action or is simply pointing fingers to blame their political adversaries at the time. I mean, that, or a government who is deconstructing all of the services that are meant to serve people during that time. So I think that that's really beautiful. I also am paying attention to, Mars mentioned, labor. I think that the many unions who are working, think about the Amazon workers, the Starbucks workers. I work in higher education, the educators who are withholding their labor. I think that's incredible. Speaking of higher education, I think it's easy to think about the progressive left as a network of nonprofit organizations, but there are so many people working outside of those institutions, like in higher education, who are putting their bodies on the line. At CUNY, we had 4 professors who were fired from Brooklyn College for their for standing in alignment and solidarity with the Palestine liberation movement. That is a modern McCarthyism that we're seeing unfold. And it's important to pay attention to how people are resisting across those different institutions. And so, and also the last thing I'll say is I teach young people, 17 to 22. They are sparring online in conversations on these gaming websites, on YouTube, on social media, about their beliefs. They're having conversations with people who think differently than them in ways that I feel like our generation circumvented because of the discomfort and because we have these echo chambers. So I think the work is happening online, offline, in higher education, in philanthropy. And there's lots of inspiration. I think the challenge for us is that we have very few levers of power right now.
Yeah.
And people will ask all the time, well, what is the point? Well, the point is to have history reflect the fact that we dissented, and also to create the conditions for doing more radical progressive work in the future.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I think that not losing sight of the power piece, I think, is absolutely crucial right now. And that part of the reason that we're in the position that we're in is that our enemies have seized power, and that our goal needs to be to take some of that power back so that we can build a more just, equitable, and thriving world for everybody. Shanelle and Mars, thank you so much for making the time to chat about the book. We will definitely have links to where people can find it to buy it in the show notes. And also, people can always request books that their library can acquire too, their local public library, which makes it available for everybody, which is awesome. So it's a pleasure to talk to you all. It's good to see you as always.
Thank you, Kaden.
Thank you so much.
My thanks again to Mars and Shanelle for joining me this week. You can find a link to buy Liberation Stories in the show notes. This show is produced by Convergence, a magazine for radical insights. I'm Kaden Mock, and our producer is Josh Elstro. Editorial assistance is provided by Akin Ola, and Kimmy David designed our cover art. If you have something to say, please drop me a line. You can send me an email that we'll consider running on an upcoming mailbag episode at mailbag@convergencemag.com. And if you'd like to support the work that we do at Convergence, bringing our movements together to strategize, struggle, and win in this crucial historical moment, you can become a member at convergencemag.com/donate. Even a few bucks a month goes a long way to making sure that our independent small team can continue to build a map for our movements. I hope this helps.